Hi, New York. Hi, Workers World Party. This is Mikisa Thompson, and I'm here with Naeema, and she's going to introduce herself. And what she's here to talk about today is environmental injustice.
Well, hi everybody. I'm Naeema Muhammed, and I am the co-director, community organizer with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network is a statewide organization, and we work with communities that's living with environmental hazards, in particular concentrated animals. Industrial agriculture is called, and landfills, waste incinerators, chicken litter burning plants, you name it, and we deal with it. And I always say to people, Eastern North Carolina is where the problem is. And Eastern North Carolina is like the dumping grounds for the state of North Carolina. Anything white people don't want in their backyards, you will find it in Eastern North Carolina.
Thank you for that, Naeema. Explain briefly environmental racism and the factors that contribute to it.
Okay, so the way we see environmental racism is the fact that what I just said really is whatever white people don't want in their backyards, you can find in the backyards of predominantly African American, Native American, and Latino communities. And those communities are the predominant people in Eastern North Carolina. And so we see environmental racism as something that's an intentional process done by government, industries, and we call it the avenues of least resistance. And they dump where they perceive people not to have enough political clout or economic power to fight them off. And so what we find as we mapped out all the hazards in North Carolina and we pinned the map for every place we found a permit where these things were issued to set up shop, we found they were all sitting in Eastern North Carolina. For example, North Carolina has 10 million industrial hogs, and the almost all of those hogs are in Eastern North Carolina. North Carolina is number 2 in the country for hog production, but we have the highest concentration of animals than any other place in the country. And one of the counties that we work with is Duplin County in the southeastern part of the state. They have 2.2 million hogs, equating to 45 hogs per person in the county. And their neighboring county, Thompson County, has 2 million hogs, equating to about 32 hogs per person. And those counties are close to each other. You enter into one without even realizing you left the other one. And so I always say, so when we look at those two counties, we're looking at 77 animals per person. And I mean, that is just a humongous amount of animals. And Duplin County is been deemed the hog capital of the world because it has more hogs than any other place in the world that we know of. And their next door neighbor is number 2. The top 10 producing counties in the country is in Eastern North Carolina. Okay, so the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network began in 1998. It was founded by Gary Grant out of Halifax County, North Carolina. Nan Freeland, who was an academician at North Carolina Central University, and Dr. Steve Wing from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who was professor in the School of Public Health Department of Epidemiology.
Okay, thank you. What industries have you seen most contributing to environmental injustice?
Okay, so the biggest one at this point that we've been dealing with for almost 2 decades is the pork industry in North Carolina. But also the waste industries are a big factor as well, because that's where we get all the landfill sightings, waste incinerators, wherever they want to dump trash. And they always wind up looking at African American communities. And so we've been fighting these things for, like I said, almost 2 decades, the pork industry. And the problem with the pork industry is having that many animals in such small areas. And then they also, the way they handle the waste from those animals, the animals are kept in little houses that look like barns. And it could be up to 5,000 animals in one of those small buildings. They have slats in the floor where the waste from the animals, the feces and urine, and the aborted piglets and anything else that they excrete goes through those slats and is flushed out into an open air lagoon that sits out in the environment. And the lagoon is just where they dug a hole in the ground, and the waste is flushed out into that lagoon through a piping system underground that runs from the hog house out to the lagoon. And when the waste is filling up in the lagoons, they irrigate it out around on the crops. And so they're spraying feces and urine out on the crops where people live, and it gets on the people's homes, on their cars. It'll get on your body if you're out there. And so the communities that's living with these animals have been forced to feel like they're living as prisoners in their own homes, because they can't just freely open their doors and windows at their choosing. They don't go outside without first checking to see if it's stinking out there. If it's not stinking, they rush out to do what they have to do so they can get back in before the odor comes, because when the odor comes, you don't want to be outside. It's just a real petric smell that's nauseating, causes people's eyes to burn, their noses to burn and run. There's a lot of upper respiratory problems in those communities. There's a high rate of asthma amongst the children, which we well documented through health studies, looking at the impacts of industrial agriculture on neighboring communities. And we found that people in those communities have high rates of asthma, high rates of upper respiratory problems, elevated blood pressures, a lot of stress and anger from having to live like that. And it's forcing people to not be able to enjoy their property in the way they meant when they moved into those areas. And they were there first. Though you hear the industry tell it, they act like people moved in after they got there, and that thus they should have known what they was moving to. But I always say that's a lie they tell from the pits of hell. And there was some recent research done by the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And the study was called the Pig Two-Back. And what they were doing in that study, because the industry was telling government that the problems from their operations was not leaving the property lines, and that people were lying and making up these things that they were saying. And so they did the study to look at whether or not this waste does leave the property lines. So what they did, they were swabbing the outsides of people's homes. They had little swabs, and they would swab the walls, outer walls, and other things around there to see if there was animal waste. And through that study, they were able to document that the waste is actually on people's homes, which we knew already. We knew that. And they also were looking at the insides of people's homes, and the waste is on the insides of people, like on their tables and walls, and they were looking at toys that children play with, these kinds of things, and the evidence is there that this waste does leave the site that it's kept on.
Now, what are they going to do with this information? Do you know? Are the people going to be helped in some kind of way?
Well, they haven't done anything, and so we have years of health studies that's been done documenting the impacts of this industry on people's lives. And it's been well presented to government. The industry knows about it. That we share it first with the community people. And, so they'll have it as a tool to use to try and defend themselves when they talk about why stuff needs to change. But it's made public, and so everybody is well aware of it. But again, the industry continue to say that people are lying and making this stuff up, and just want to put what they call the contract growers are the used to be family farmers that was forced out of their family farm because this industry came to town and became like a monopoly, and people were not able to keep their own little farms going and survive. So they wind up going into business with Smithfield based on a pack of lies they told them and some contracts that's really unscrupulous and ought to be criminal behavior, that they've done to these family farmers and caused them to go into business with them. And then Smithfield said they own the pigs, they own the trucks, they own the feed, they own the houses the animals kept in, they own the animals, they own the trucks that come through the communities to deliver these animals and pick up the dead ones or the ones that's ready for slaughter. And they own, and the contract growers own the waste. And that was till recently. Okay.
Own the waste.
Own the waste. And so that's what they get out of the deal. But the sad part about that is now they got this whole new idea of waste to energy. And so they got this big conversation going in North Carolina about biogas and using that animal waste to produce gas and energy that they can sell, and then they can make money off of it. Smithfield wants to be the owner of the waste now, and so that means the contract grower wouldn't again get anything.
So again, being cut out even after they lose their property, their land to Smithfield now.
Yeah.
This.
And they're forced to do business with them because they've invested everything about their lives is invested into those contracts. If they get out, they will lose everything that they have. Their homes, their way of life, everything is gone. And so for years, the communities, we have recognized that the contract growers are in a catch-22, that they're in no better position than the communities that they are forced to do harm to by, doing business with Smithfield. But the industry has managed to convince them that people like me, a community organizer, is just somebody that want to put them out of business. We just environmental troublemakers. These are the kinds of things they say. And the contract growers was buying into that. And, so we're trying to change that narrative and see if we can work to bring the contract growers and the communities closer together to let this industry know, we all fed up with their lives.
Right.
And so that's one of the tasks that we are hoping to change in North Carolina. Because there's a lot of ground contamination that takes place where this waste is spread out because it seeps into the ground. It gets into the waterways in the communities, ditch areas and stuff, and it winds up in our rivers and streams in North Carolina, which again, that has been well documented by the water keepers and the river keepers of North Carolina, and they partner with the EJ network. We all work close together in, producing and looking at the evidence of how this energy has been operating, and then sharing this information with the public so that people can be made aware of the damages that's being done and the harm that's being done to people, and people being our number one priority. And what the water keepers for years, the water keepers and the river keepers were working in their own little silo. In EJ, we was working in our own little silo, but we were all working at the same issue. And one day we realized, hey, if we come together, we make our voices stronger. And the industry would be pissed off because they were benefiting from everybody staying in their own little silos. And the water keepers and river keepers is predominantly a white organization. They were looking at the rivers and the streams, and like we always say, they were like a traditional environmental group, And we always say they just look at the rivers, the streams, and the things. They never consider what's happening to the people. And environmental movement, we look at what's happening to people first, and then we think about the other things and look at what the other, damages are. And so we came together, and the Water Keepers and River Keepers then adopted our principle of environmental justice, that everybody have a right to a safe and clean environment and should be able to live free of these environmental hazards, And so we worked together now.
That's good.
And the industry was totally pissed off about that.
Well,
they did not like it.
That's excellent. So that means some changes are going to be happening soon then.
Well,
with the collaboration, I hope.
We hope. And we have two other things that we're hoping will make a difference. And that is, number one, there was a class action nuisance lawsuit filed against the pork industry. And it was against the industry and not the contract growers. There's a difference in when you talk about the contract growers and when you talk about the industry itself. And so the industry is like the monopoly, and the contract growers are just little offsprings. Okay? But the class action lawsuit was filed against the industry for the damages that's been done to people. Their health harm, their way of life harmed, their property values just so depleted till their property is being rendered useless to them. If they want to move, they can't sell because nobody in their right mind is going to buy it and live there. One man in the community had his property appraised because he had two homes. He wanted to sell one. The appraiser came and told him at the end, he might as well give it away because he wasn't going to be able to sell it based on everything that was around, his environment there. And but so this is what people are faced with. And so many times we hear people say, well, why don't they just move? Well, why don't the industry just move?
Right.
Why don't they just clean up their crap?
That's right.
And so that's what we've been fighting for, because this lagoon and spray field system, there is another way that waste can be handled. In 1998, they had what they call the Smithfield Agreement. Under the Smithfield Agreement, they gave this researcher at North Carolina State University $17.2 million to identify clean technology other than this lagoon and waste system. And the researcher, his name was Mike Williams, was able to identify 5 new technologies that could be used that would be cleaner than this lagoon and waste system. And the industry came out and said it was not feasible for them to get the technology on the ground because of the economics of getting it done. And we was like, oh yeah, so you making $1 billion worth of profit every year and you can't get this technology on the ground? But our government is responsible for that, as well as our regulatory system agency, because they should have made them do this. Yeah. But, they have our legislators lock, stock, and barrel under their control, and they are controlling our regulatory system. And when the regulatory agency I'm referring to is the department, it's now called the Department of Environmental Quality. But they are the ones that issue permits to businesses when they come looking for, to set up shop in North Carolina. And so they issue the permits and let them do what they're doing. And so we've been trying to show them that, the technology is there, why don't you make them get it on the ground? And nobody has done anything. And at the legislative level, the legislators are always coming up with new policies and bills to protect industries in this state. And an example of that, you all might have heard of it, I'm not sure, but back in last year in April, just before the summer, they had this bill called House Bill 467. It was called the Agriculture and Forestry Nuisance Bill, and it was sponsored by the state representative from Duplin County, remember Duplin County is the hog capital of the world. And his constituents have been suffering for nearly 2 decades because of this industry. He bring it upon himself to sponsor this House Bill 467. And under this bill, they want to prevent citizens from being able to sue industries that harm them. Well, also a part of that bill, they had a retroactive statement there. And under the retroactive statement, they want to attach this current nuisance lawsuit. They want to attach that to the bill, which means had it passed with the retroactive statement, the lawsuits that's currently in federal court would have been shut down right at that point. And people would not be able to go forth with the lawsuit in the manner that they're doing now. And so we knew that the industry had put them up to it because they saw, this class action lawsuit was filed about 4 years ago by 500 citizens from eastern North Carolina that said, we've been harmed and we want some retribution. And the lawsuit got accepted by the courts. And so they're currently in the federal court in Raleigh, and the cases are being heard before this Judge Britt, a federal judge. And the industry did not want that to happen. They did not want to be in court with these cases and to have a jury decide if people's evidence is strong enough to award them damages. And so to try and prevent it, they got this guy, Jimmy Dixon, to sponsor this bill. And that joker, when the bill was running, we went up there and we got people from the communities to come to Raleigh, go in the legislature in those hearings and testify about the conditions they were living with so that all the legislators could hear them and see them as well. And number one, to first see that they all look the same, So again, this is no accident that everybody that's being dumped on look the same. And so they testified. Some of the legislators caught on to what this Jimmy Dixon character was trying to do. And so they said, well, first of all, we are not going to be party to violating people's constitutional rights to, redress their conditions. And so we're not voting with no retroactive statement. We think it's unconstitutional. And it seems like you're doing the industry's bidding for them, And so they knocked that retroactive statement out. And based on that current nuisance lawsuit, again, is now in federal court. And but what it also means is that from this point forward, any other communities that's damaged in the same way or, similarly, will not be able to file any lawsuits for retribution, which we still think is unconstitutional. And we do intend to challenge that. Because we know it's unconstitutional. That you can come harm me, but you don't have to be held accountable. And so we're addressing that as well. And thank you for the opportunity. Bye, Monica.